U.S. military officials have admitted that they supported the rebels in Syria and oversaw their assault as they overthrew the Syrian government. This was reported by the major British newspaper, The Telegraph, in a bombshell article titled, "U.S. Prepared Syrian Rebel Group to Help Topple Bashar al-Assad," referring to the former president of Syria. This article noted that fighters funded and trained by America and Britain had advanced warning that the Syrian government would be overthrown, and the U.S. helped to oversee this operation. The U.S. military has also revealed that it has had 2,000 troops occupying Syrian territory for years now. Previously, the Pentagon had claimed there were 900 troops. We now know that was misleading. The actual number is 2,000. And the U.S. military has built several military bases, especially in the eastern part of Syria. But the U.S. military also has a military base in the southern part of Syria on the border of Iraq, which is called Atanf. And the eastern part of Syria, which is under U.S. military control, represents around 1/3 of the entire country's territory. And it just so happens to be the part of Syria where the vast majority of the country's oil fields are located. And the U.S. military has been filmed occupying Syria's oil fields. And this is also the part of Syria that produces a lot of wheat. And the U.S. has been occupying those wheat fields in alliance with Kurdish-led militias known as the SDF, which was partially created by the Pentagon. When Bashar al-Assad was in power, the U.S. government was using its control over Syria's oil and wheat fields to starve the Syrian government of the revenue that it would get from exporting oil, which caused an inflation crisis. And they also prevented the government from getting access to its wheat fields, which exacerbated a shortage of bread and other food because Syria had imported a lot of food because so much of the country is desert. It's not very good for growing food. That fertile territory was very strategic while the U.S. was occupying it to starve the Syrian government economically. In addition, the U.S. had imposed brutal economic sanctions known as the Caesar sanctions that caused an economic collapse that led to the complete collapse of the Syrian state. And since Assad has been overthrown and U.S.-backed rebels have taken control of Syria, the White House has made it clear that those 2,000 U.S. troops are not going anywhere. They're going to continue occupying Syrian territory. So what was the role of the U.S. military in this operation to overthrow the Assad government? I'm going to go through some of the details of this bombshell report in the Telegraph, the British newspaper. I'm reading, quote, "The United States prepared a rebel force to join the offensive that overthrew the regime of Bashar al-Assad, fighters have claimed. British and American trained fighters in the Revolutionary Commando Army, RCA, were told, 'This is your moment,' in a briefing by U.S. Special Forces before Assad was ousted. This is the first indication that Washington had prior knowledge of the offensive because the U.S. helped to plan it. And this U.S.-funded rebel group that the U.S. helped to create, called RCA, revealed that it had been told by the U.S. military to scale up its forces and be ready for an attack that could lead to the end of the Assad regime. The U.S. military told them, 'Everything is about to change. This is your moment. Either Assad will fall or you will fall.' And they told the rebels to be ready." Now, the excuse that the United States used to justify continued support for these rebels is that the U.S. claimed that they were fighting against remnants of ISIS, Islamic State, which is absurd because ISIS has been destroyed for years now. But this was the excuse that Washington used to continue arming and training and funding these rebels to prepare them for overthrowing the Assad government. In fact, this article noted that the U.S. still pays a salary to these Syrian rebels from the so-called RCA. And in the weeks before they overthrew the Syrian government, the U.S.-controlled air base Atanf in southern Syria on the border of Iraq, the U.S.-funded rebels met with U.S. military forces and the U.S. helped them to grow. This article notes that there were so-called freelance units, these warlords and gangs that were brought under the command of the U.S.-funded and trained militia. And then these U.S.-backed rebels in the southern part of Syria launched an assault moving toward the Syrian capital, Damascus. They did this in alliance with rebranded Al-Qaeda, the group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which was based in the north. So here I'm looking at a map, and it shows that the northern part of Syria is occupied by Turkey, a member of NATO and a close U.S. ally. The western part of Syria, the major cities like Aleppo, Idlib, Latakia, and Homs, and then of course the capital, Damascus, those major cities are controlled by HTS, which is rebranded Al-Qaeda. And then the U.S. military was backing these rebels that it funded and created, this militia that it created in the southern part of Syria, based in the U.S. military base Atanf, and they were marching northwest, while the Turkish-backed rebranded Al-Qaeda forces in the north were marching southwest. So this was a joint operation involving both the U.S. military and Turkey. In fact, when this operation was launched in late November, the Western media was in contact with these foreign-backed rebels, and the mainstream French media outlet, France 24, admitted that, quote, opposition sources in touch with Turkish intelligence said Turkey, which supports the rebels, had given a green light to the offensive. This was also clearly coordinated with Israel, so it was the US, NATO member Turkey, and Israel that were working together to back this offensive to overthrow the Syrian government. And it's not a coincidence that the Syrian rebels, backed by Turkey and the US, launched their offensive on the same day that Israel signed a so-called ceasefire with Lebanon. And Israel immediately violated that ceasefire and carried out dozens and dozens of attacks and bombed Lebanese territory. But the point is that Israel had pushed for this ceasefire to try to weaken the Lebanese resistance forces, especially Hezbollah, after Israel had decapitated the leadership of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah was one of the main allies of Syria. So Israel had helped to divide the resistance forces in the region, which gave the US and Turkey the opportunity to launch this offensive using their proxies inside Syria to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. And Russia also has been tied down in Ukraine, fighting a proxy war against NATO in Ukraine. So Russia was not able to send many forces to help the Syrian government. Going back to this bombshell report in The Telegraph, the article reveals that Washington not only knew about the offensive led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, but Washington had precise intelligence about its scale. So the U.S. knew everything that was happening because the U.S. was overseeing this operation. And this article in The Telegraph pointed out that the so-called rebel groups in southern Syria, they were not only funded by the U.S., they were created by U.S. special forces and also trained by British counterparts in Jordan. So the United States oversaw all of this operation. It was not organic. It was not plucky Syrian freedom fighters trying to overthrow a horrible, evil regime. It was a U.S. operation funded by the U.S. military with forces trained by the U.S. and the British in a unit that was created by the U.S. in alliance with rebranded Syrian Al-Qaeda. If you still don't believe me, here are some more details from this mainstream British newspaper, which again, the sources of this report are from the US military. They are boasting to the British media about how they oversaw this operation. The article notes that US military officers at the Atanf base in southern Syria brought together a group of different Syrian rebels under the command of the RCA, which was funded and created by the US. I'm reading here from the report, quote, all members of the force continued to be armed by the U.S. and to receive their salary of $400 a month, nearly 12 times what the soldiers in the now defunct Syrian army were paid, end quote. So This is another very important detail. Why did the Syrian army not fight? Why did soldiers lay down their arms? A big reason is because the US and European sanctions, known as the Caesar sanctions, completely destroyed the Syrian economy, causing hyperinflation. The Syrian currency lost most of its value, and that meant that people working for the Syrian government, people in the Syrian army, were getting paid almost nothing. They were getting paid like $30 a month when you adjusted for the exchange rate because of the horrible inflation. And then the US military was occupying the oil fields and wheat fields, causing economic collapse. So Syrian soldiers said, we're not going to risk our lives for $30. They didn't want to fight anymore after a decade of US-backed war devastated their country. So they didn't fight. Instead, the US helped oversee this operation to take over Syria. And I need to stress, this was done in alliance with Al-Qaeda, or rebranded Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda 2.0. Don't believe me? Again, this is from one of the most mainstream British newspapers, The Telegraph. This article notes that the so-called RCA, the rebel group funded and created by the US military, was working in alliance with fighters from HTS, rebranded Syrian Al-Qaeda. As The Telegraph put it, RCA and HTS, quote, were cooperating and communications between the two forces was being coordinated by the Americans at Entente, end quote. So the US military was directly coordinating communication and operations during this offensive between its own proxies and Al-Qaeda 2.0. This newspaper pointed out how ironic this is, that the US is in an effective alliance with HTS, which was Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria. And also ironic is that the US and Turkey were both supporting these same rebel factions, while in northeastern Syria, Turkey is fighting against the US-funded Kurdish-led militias in the SDF. So the US and Turkey were collaborating together to overthrow the Syrian government, but meanwhile, the proxies of Turkey, which, as you can see in the map, control a significant part of northern Syria, are fighting against the US proxies in northeastern Syria. And if you look at this map, what you can see is that the US and Turkey, and now Israel as well, control a huge part of Syria. So the US is occupying 1/3 of Syria in the northeast. The US is occupying, through its proxies, 1/5 of territory in the south of Syria. Rebranded Al-Qaeda, backed by Turkey and the US and all of these foreign forces, now controls the major cities. And meanwhile, Israel is colonizing more and more Syrian territory in the southwest. Israel has illegally annexed the Syrian sovereign territory in the Golan Heights, which, according to international law, has been illegally occupied by Israel since 1967. And Israel has invaded Syria, sending troops further in, and Israel has seized the tallest mountain in Syria, which is called Mount Hermon. And Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a wanted war criminal facing charges of crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court at The Hague, Netanyahu went to Mount Hermon in occupied Syrian territory. He boasted that Israel has taken this territory. He made it clear that Israel's not going to ever give it back to Syria. And now Israel is planning on putting radar systems on the tallest mountain in Syria in order to spy all across Syria and Lebanon. And there are reports that Israel is planning on putting artillery on Mount Hermon in Syria so that in the future, Israel could launch artillery shells at Damascus or another major city or into Lebanon as part of Syria's goal, backed by the US, to colonize and control more territory in the region. So we're seeing a kind of neo-colonial takeover of Syria by the US, Turkey, and Israel all working together. And in my analysis here at Geopolitical Economy Report, I have repeatedly cited a very important document, a piece of evidence, which is an email that was sent by the current U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, back in 2012, when he was the top aide to Hillary Clinton, when she was the Secretary of State in the Obama administration. Jake Sullivan is now National Security Advisor in the Biden administration. But back in 2012, he sent Hillary Clinton this email, and in it, he admitted that, quote, AQ is on our side in Syria, end quote. That is Al-Qaeda. He's acknowledging that the U.S. has been allied with Al-Qaeda in Syria for a decade. And immediately after violent protests broke out in Syria in 2011, the U.S. helped to militarize the situation, and the CIA launched its infamous Operation Timber Sycamore, in which, according to the Washington Post, the CIA was spending $1 billion per year arming and training these Al-Qaeda-linked rebels, these extremists. And again, according to the Washington Post, this made up $1 out of every $15 in the CIA's budget. Those billions of dollars were going to arming and training what the U.S. called the so-called moderate rebels. But as the Washington Post also reported in 2015, those U.S.-trained fighters in Syria then gave their weapons to Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria was called Jabhat al-Nusra. And so the U.S. in reality was helping to create, at least to strengthen, what became the largest Al-Qaeda affiliate in world history, which was Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. Then in 2017, Jabhat al-Nusra rebranded and claimed that it was no longer Al-Qaeda. It went through a series of name changes, including at first Jabhat Fatah Sham, and then finally Hayat Tahrir Sham. But the U.S. Embassy in Syria made it very clear in 2017 that it did not recognize the rebranding, that HTS, it was still Al-Qaeda, and the U.S. State Department released a $10 million reward, a bounty, on the head of the leader of Syrian Al-Qaeda, Mohammed al-Julani. But fast forward 7 years later, and the U.S. State Department has now lifted that bounty on the head of the new leader of Syria, who was the former leader of Al-Qaeda. He previously went by the name Abu Muhammad al-Julani, but he has since gotten rid of that nom de guerre, his war name, and instead now he's using his birth name, which is Ahmad Ashara. In December, less than 2 weeks after the Syrian government was overthrown, the U.S. State Department set a high-level delegation to Syria to meet with the former leader of Al-Qaeda. This meeting included the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Barbara Leaf, and she said the meeting with the former leader of Al-Qaeda was very productive, and he was very pragmatic. Those are quotes. And a U.S. State Department spokesperson confirmed that the U.S. diplomats discussed transition principles supported by the U.S. That is to say, they're giving their blessing to this Al-Qaeda rebranded government in Syria, which the U.S. helped to put in power. The BBC noted that this was the first time in more than a decade that a formal U.S. diplomat met with a regime official inside Syria. Now that the Assad government has been overthrown and is governed by the former leader of Al-Qaeda, the U.S. is having diplomatic meetings with him. The BBC described this meeting as a show of readiness to deal with HTS, which the U.S. still designates as a terrorist organization. Washington is effectively laying down a set of conditions before it would consider delisting the group, which is the path towards sanctions relief. So what is the BBC saying? It's the U.S. State Department is telling the former leader of Al-Qaeda, saying, we help put you in power. You need to listen to us. You must follow our orders. If you do what we want, if you are an obedient U.S. puppet, we will delist you as a terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda leader, and we will end the sanctions that we put on Syria that led to the collapse of the Assad government by destroying the Syrian economy. And of course, while this is happening, the Western media is doing propaganda for the former leader of Al-Qaeda, including British state media, the BBC. They published a softball interview in person. A BBC reporter went to Damascus and did a softball interview with the former leader of Al-Qaeda, again, formerly known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani. Now he's Ahmad Ashara. And the BBC whitewashed him as a moderate. It insisted that he's not a threat to the West or to neighbors, by which they mean Israel. And of course, that's one of the main demands that the U.S. is making, telling the rebranded Al-Qaeda leader in Syria that we will recognize you as the government, we will delist you, we would end sanctions as long as you have good relations with Israel. And he's made it clear, again, the former leader of Al-Qaeda, he said very clearly he does not want a conflict with Israel. I mean, the Western propaganda campaign for rebranded Al-Qaeda in Syria is incredible. Some of these headlines they seem like satire. I mean, it's incredible. So the Telegraph in the UK published an article whitewashing this Al-Qaeda leader. The headline was, "How Syria's diversity-friendly jihadists plan on building a state." Diversity-friendly jihadists. That's their name for Al-Qaeda 2.0. CNN published a very similar puff piece, which showed a photo of al-Julani, or Shara, previously when he was the leader of Al-Qaeda, and now since he's rebranded with, support of these PR firms. And the CNN headline was, "How Syria's rebel leader went from radical jihadist to a blazer-wearing revolutionary." So, on that note, I'm going to conclude. Rebranded Al-Qaeda is in power now in Syria thanks to the US. They've declared victory. Israel's declared victory. Turkey's declared victory. But at the end of the day, the people who lost most are the Syrian people, unfortunately, and the Palestinian people who have been abandoned by the new Al-Qaeda 2.0 regime in Syria. But there's more reporting to come in the future. I've been doing a lot of research on this issue. I think it's very important to understand. So please be sure to like and subscribe to follow our reporting when we publish new videos and podcasts. I'm Ben Norton. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.